So I think we'll begin. First of all, thank you to all three of our speakers for joining, and thank you to all of our participants for joining us for what's going to certainly be a fascinating event on water security in the Middle East and North Africa. Just in terms of the format of the event, as I mentioned before, each of our speakers will give a brief introduction, after which we'll open the floor to questions and answers. When we get to questions and answers, you'll find that there is a raise hand function on the bottom of your screen. So if you have a question and would like to ask, please raise your hand and we'll unmute participants in the order in which they raise their hand so that everybody could ask their question. And we just ask that in the interest of time, everybody limit their question to a brief question, and also please no comments or statements. A brief introduction about ourselves. We're the Cambridge Middle East and North Africa Forum. For anybody who this is their first MENA event, we're a think tank based out of the University of Cambridge, which focuses on the research and study of the Middle East and North Africa. We have a number of interesting projects going on, which I'll just take a brief moment to share with everybody. Other than speaker events, such as the one we currently have tonight, we have a news update service, which is published by a team of 10 regional language experts on a weekly basis, which is free to register for and which you can find more information about on our website. It's a news update which summarizes the past week's events and gives a strategic perspective on what we can expect from the coming week. Other than that, we also have a journal called Manara Journal. The most recent volume is about to come out, and we've just begun recruiting calls for submissions for our next volume, which is going to be focused on 10 years since the Arab Spring. We accept submissions from students, from professionals, from experts, and people who are developing their interest in the region. And we also pay for submissions such that we're always happy to receive your pitch and really expand our network of people who contribute. Without further ado, I'm just going to briefly introduce our three esteemed panelists for this evening in the order in which they'll speak. Dr. Oded Eran is currently a senior research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv and served as the former director of the INSS. I'm giving brief biographies because if I had to get into the depth of every one of our speakers' biographies, that could be an event in and of itself. Sarah Al-Bahuti is a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. She is the founder of ECOnsult and a senior advisor to the Egyptian president on sustainable development, a role that she's held since 2014. And Dr. Hussein Amery is currently the director of the Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences Division at the Colorado School of Mines. He's an expert on water and food security in the Middle East. Thank you again to our participants for joining this evening, and a special thank you to our panel. And we'll begin with Dr. Oded, with your remarks.
Good evening, and thank you for the introduction. And I thank you, MENA, for organizing this event. I would like to concentrate on the triangular nexus of water, energy, and environment. And I hope that I can do it with the time allotted to me. I think that if you look broadly from above on the region, first of all, you know that this is, you will know soon enough to know that this is a very arid zone, probably the driest on the globe. And war can start this summer on issues of water. Take, for example, the situation today between Egypt and Ethiopia. I would allow Sarah to speak about it in detail if she wants, but the situation is very tense. 3 countries are involved, and if no settlement is reached, I don't predict a war, but I think that this is quite a likelihood. Then if you look at Israel and Jordan, the situation, the political situation, is that the king of Jordan has not spoken to our prime minister in the recent 2.5 years. And this is not only, but also because there is a deep disagreement on what is called the Red Dead Canal. This is a proposal which the Jordanians very much like, conveying desalinated water from the Red Sea to the Dead Sea, and taking some of the water to the populated, densely populated areas of Jordan, that is to say, Amman itself and Irbid. Then, if you believe Tom Friedman, who is a major principal journalist in the New York Times, he believes, for example, that the civil war in Syria, which is part of what is called the Arab Spring, has began or started because of the drought, the very acute situation of no water in Syria. And then I would add to it a situation that 15 miles from where I live, people have in their disposal half of the water that I can enjoy. These are the Palestinians 15 miles from me. And this is a result of an agreement which was signed, the Oslo Agreement, which was signed 25 years ago. I am not saying that a war is once again likely, and no war, to the best of my recollection, has started in the Middle East because of water, except a very minor skirmish in the mid-60s when the Arab states tried to convert the sources of the Jordan River and transmit them to Jordan, to the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, not to the Jordan River, which is feeding the Sea of Galilee. And the situation is that there are most countries in the region don't enjoy fresh water resources. And the only solution that can make water available in endless quantities is desalination. And some assistance for fresh water can come from countries outside the region which have water, for example, Turkey, which should feed more water through the Tigris and the Euphrates to Iraq and Syria. But this is, I don't want to dwell on it because I would like to concentrate on the small sub-Middle East region, that is to say, Israel, Palestine, Jordan. And I think that, once again, the only solution is desalination of water. Desalination basically is energy. That is to say that if you don't have energy resources, you need to import them in order to salinate water if you have a coast near you or near the populated areas. Palestine has no resources, or major part of Palestine. Gaza does have an access to the Mediterranean, but has no energy. it has some gas off the coast, unused, unexploited for the time being. It would take years for it to be able to benefit from the gas. And even then, I'm not so sure, since the price of gas is falling down. The only situation which can provide a satisfactory solution to this situation and combine all the three elements, once again, water, energy, environment, is a medium-term solution using the gas that Israel already produces in the Mediterranean to desalinate water of the Mediterranean on the coast of Israel, conveying the water to Jordan and on the way to Palestine. There's no reason why the population in Jenin or in Nablus or in Hebron should benefit or should not benefit from the same situation which I benefit from, and that is to say, I have endless quantity of water at my disposal. If I decide to wash myself once an hour, I can do it. It's just a matter of cost. The solution that the Jordanians are hooked upon is unfortunately very expensive. It's twice the cost which will have to be paid for conveying desalinated water from the Red Sea. It doesn't bring water to the Palestinians. So once again, this is a solution, an interim solution. Why am I saying interim? Because I think that the target of the international community, as far as climate the climate situation, is to be able to, in 2030, certainly in 2050, to have green energy. And once again, there is a possibility to have triangular situation between all the three entities that I mentioned, and that is using the wide area, the spaces in Jordan, which are mostly desert. Out of, I'm joking, out of 365 days a year, Jordan benefits from 400 days of sun, and it can certainly be a hub for solar energy. And then this solar energy is certainly green energy. It can be transferred, some of it sold to Israel, and there is the exchange of desalinated water for green energy, for clean environment, which the Palestinians can benefit from. We are talking about short distances, and solving this is certainly not going to solve the political problem between these three entities. I'm not saying it, but I'm saying that if we wait for the Jerusalem problem to be solved until we go to this solution of water, we may not have a solution to Jerusalem, and we certainly will have no solution to the water, environment, and energy situation. So I think that I believe that both the Biden administration and the EU, which are certainly working to amend the situation which was created during the Trump administration, that there was almost no dialogue between the two sides of the Atlantic, they may look for ways to return to a political process in the Middle East beyond what is called the Abraham Accords, make the process more inclusive of both Jordan and Palestine. And I think that this opens up a whole field of opportunities, which, once again, do not give a political situation to every question and item on our agenda, political agenda, but it may create a different political environment conducive to the attainment of the two-state solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Oded, for those comments. Very, very interesting. And I think it'll become apparent to our participants over the course of the event how similar issues play out in different geographies in the region. And I think it'll be interesting to make that comparison towards the end of, you know, the similarities and differences between these different perspectives on the issue. Next is Sarah Al-Bahouri. I'm going to unmute you now, so you could also make your remarks. Thank you.
Hello, thanks, MENA, for having me, and it's actually quite exciting to be back at my university. So I wanted to talk from a different perspective, and I just wanted to give an overview of Africa. As Professor Eran was saying, that of course it's a very arid region. But one of the major things is that we have to look at the changing demographics and the role of climate change in all of this. So we know that the region is getting hotter and drier. There's very little rainfall, and that 80% of some of these countries rely on fresh water for their agricultural produce. So the problem is it has several different dimensions when dealing with water scarcity. And North Africa, it has the lowest per capita water resource in the world. So that's from one perspective, that climate change is going to play a massive role in the choices that these countries in North Africa make in terms of water as a resource. The other thing is that we have to look at the needs of the region, and that while planning for water management, there needs to be an understanding of integrated policy, but also the ability to forecast. And this is something that there's a lot of focus on nationally here in Egypt, forecasting the challenges of the future, so that when you are negotiating, or that when you are predicting what are the directions and the options that you have, you need to be able to realize that maybe 20 years down the line, we know that we might have a temperature rise of 3.6 degrees as opposed to less than 2. That's a huge significance as to how we're going to react. So the variables that come into the political arena with water management are going to change. They're not going to stay the same. The next thing is that Africa, especially North Africa, is a fairly young region, and there's a massive need and demand for the 3 billion consumers in the region for growth. And this is where the demand for water will increase, and hence the need to fulfill this demand will require that several of the different countries seek different options. Egypt has made concerted effort recently to connect with Africa and to connect with North Africa a lot more, so that it's seeing how we can exchange culture. We have a lot of similarities with our environmental challenges, with our need for entrepreneurship and culture, etc. And this sort of bilateral discussion that we're having shows that investments in Egypt and in North Africa will look towards solution-based issues. One of the main things that we need to find solutions for is water efficiency. So these kind of discussions are a great way to connect different cultures into the discussion without just politicizing this water management resource crisis that we are having in the region. It also sees the opportunity as to where we will have similar solutions and similar challenges. And this is where the policy needs to get a bit more diverse and creative. The commodification of water and politicizing and making it a security issue has distanced the issue of water scarcity from development discussions and also from public awareness. And it's this very public awareness that's come back in the past several years, in Egypt especially, that it's becoming more and more of a public discussion that water is a right, water has more dimensional values than just national security. It's connected to people culturally, it's connected to the socioeconomics, it's connected to the rural and the urban environment, and it also crosses borders. I mean, it's a natural ecosystem, you know, and it flows in its own particular way. And in one sense, that makes water transcend conflict and transcend aggression and transcend a lot of the media attributed discussions when talking about water. So from one perspective, the policies around water are becoming more public. There are more and more discussions. This is the first thing. The second thing is many states have seen failure attributed to wars and conflict when it comes to resources. It hasn't succeeded. It hasn't succeeded with other natural resources. It hasn't succeeded with minerals, with oil. So conflict isn't part of the foreign policy of many of the countries in the Nile Basin. And therefore, and Egypt, it's not in Egypt's foreign policy or interest to go straight into conflict. And so the negotiations will continue. And there's a public support for this kind of alignment with that. Avoiding conflict is a matter of, you know, national support, but it also gives way for nations to look at different solutions. And I agree that the various solutions that will come about need to be quite diverse. So the first thing is to look at how water efficiency can be integrated in economic reform policy in general. In Egypt, we've had vast economic reform measures, and one of them was to remove the subsidies from energy and water. And by removing these subsidies, suddenly you gave more and more weight to saving energy and water. So it's become part of an integral part of the economic growth plan in Egypt. The investment in Egypt is not just to think about water efficiency, it's to think about investment in, firstly, technologies that support water efficiency, entrepreneurship and innovation, in desalination, using a diverse energy portfolio. So we're talking about gas, renewable energy, hydro energy. We're talking about generating energy from plants, all sorts of different investment in energy. And the one that I specialize in, which is efficiency in building and the construction sector. And this is one of the fastest growing sectors in Egypt because it's there. Housing is there to meet the demands of growing populations. And so there's a concerted effort with regulations and policy to look into how, before we look at what other countries are doing, how can we work to save water, and how can agricultural technology as well play its role? And this is where the investment should be coming in, and the support. in the growth of the green economy is going to come in. So with North Africa, with such a young and vibrant population that is really seeking to look at solutions, there's a lot of potential in looking at how we can approach the policies and how can we approach the innovation while having bilateral talks. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We're going to move on now to Dr. Hussein. I'm going to unmute you so you can address the forum.
Thank you for that. Can I share my screen?
Yes, one moment. Okay, go ahead.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Good evening to you. I'm Hussein Amery. I'm at Colorado School of Mines, and I've been working on water and food security issues for in the Gulf states for about 10 years. About 6 years ago, I published a book on the subject. I called it Arab Water Security Threats and Opportunities in the Gulf States, published by Cambridge University Press. And that's the theme of the remarks that I'm going to make this evening. So by way of reminder of the context that we're talking about in the Gulf states, we're talking about arid to semi-arid region that is energy rich and water starved. At the World Economic Forum 5-6 years ago, when business and political leaders of the Middle East and North Africa were asked, they reported that the one risk that they are least prepared for dealing with in their countries is water crisis. And by way of conceptualizing the threats to water and food security in the region, these threats can be categorized as falling into natural threats, economic threats, human or political threats, and technical threats. I'm intentionally going relatively quickly over my remarks because I want to leave ample time for questions and answers. So if you look at the region as a whole, and we see that there has been a growing gap between production and consumption of grain. In other words, the region has been increasingly dependent on food imports for the last few decades. And this is partly related to the fact that the quality of life for the majority of residents of the Middle East has been increasing. And as a result, they consume more protein and they consume, they develop a different dietary habits. And these different dietary habits typically include more meat and more, and meat is very water intensive. Meat has a very high water footprint. So, so food imports obviously come, most food imports to the different countries in the Middle East mostly come through by ship, and the trade routes are at times threatened by being blockaded, and so food shipments can potentially be interrupted. And this was seen not so much food imports being interrupted was seen in the case of Qatar when neighboring countries embargoed the country, embargoed Qatar from 2017 to 2020. And in this case, in Qatar's case, its border with Saudi Arabia effectively was a strait of sorts, because its border with Saudi Arabia is the only land border that it has with any country. And obviously, Qatar receives a lot of food shipments from Jordan and other countries over land. And these significant food imports were interrupted as a result of the embargo. The picture, the map on the bottom right shows the fact that for Qatari Airlines to make a trip to Beirut, a trip that I've taken a couple of times, they actually had to fly that route because they're not allowed to fly over Saudi Arabia. And security officials at the highest levels have long been saying that water infrastructure can potentially be a target of bad actors. So given the fact that the Gulf states are water starved and the fact that food can be used as a political weapon, way back in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Saudi Arabia decided to have self-sufficiency in its most basic staple, bread. So they wanted to have self-sufficiency in wheat production. So they heavily subsidized the entire production process of wheat, thereby significantly increasing production in the country. So much so that at around 1990, the Desert Kingdom of Saudi Arabia became a net exporter of wheat. Then in 2008, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia realized that we've invested $20 or more billion in this project, in this experiment. And we have decimated or significantly reduced our groundwater supplies. So it costs us a lot of money, and it significantly reduced our groundwater supplies. And groundwater supplies in Saudi Arabia are fossil water, meaning water that has been trapped in subterranean areas. And so you use that water once and then it's gone, you lose it. So they've reversed in 2008 their policy of subsidizing wheat production, and they've since completely stopped the subsidy, and wheat farming has ceased in Saudi Arabia. In addition to these policies, Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states have been outsourcing their food production in Africa and beyond. And the problem with outsourcing food is that if there's food shortage, the problem with outsourcing food production is that if there's food shortage in the producing country, they're gonna favor their own people being fed as opposed to exporting food to other countries. So that is a potential headache for food importing countries. And when Qatar was put under embargo in June 2017, they immediately launched into a food self-sufficiency program, especially in terms of self-sufficiency in perishable goods. And they created a massive dairy farm at a very, very high cost. And when I interviewed a senior manager at Baladna, this major dairy farm in Qatar, and he told me a whole lot of things about how the company was started and what have you. When I asked about actually very impressive facilities, when I asked him about the cost, he said, food production in Qatar under these circumstances is a national security matter. When it comes to national security, we don't spare any cost. So cost is not an issue. For some time now, the Gulf states have been relying on desalination, and desalination is extremely energy intensive. Some have described this desalination process as converting oil to water. So in the long haul, this is unsustainable. I must also mention that there is significant research that to use renewable energy sources to desalinate. So the coastal areas of the Arab Gulf states are dotted with desalination plants on which they depend primarily for domestic consumption. So what agriculture that exists in the Gulf states relies on groundwater supplies. So lots of desalination plants along the coast of the Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and other countries. And right across the water from these desalination plants, we see there's a nuclear facility for Iran. It's the Bushehr plant. And this particular plant sits on an earthquake active zone. So if there was ever to be an earthquake in that area, and it is again an active earthquake zone, there could potentially be a radioactive spill into the Gulf, and that would damage the water. I mean, that would make probably the water intake in the Gulf for the desalination plants unusable. Cannot forget climate change. Tropical cyclones are very common in the Indian Ocean. What is uncommon is that for these cyclones to touch land in the Arabian Peninsula, and increasingly over the last 30 or so years, they have been touching land more frequently than ever before. And again, the destiny is, desalination is destiny, as our guest earlier said, Oded, he may not have used these words, but essentially desalination is destiny. Yet for the massive city of Riyadh, a city of 5 or 6 million people, it used to depend on a single desalination plant, which if it was to break down or attacked or something, the country could be in serious trouble, as we saw in the one of the WikiLeaks in 2008. Fast forward to the present, we've all been hearing about the series of attacks on critical infrastructure as well as shipping in the Arab Gulf states, including very recently, just about a week ago, an attack on an Israeli registered ship, and by far the biggest attack on critical infrastructure happened in September of 2019, when kamikaze drone and cruise missiles struck Aramco's refinery facilities in Khurais and Abu Qir. And the Secretary of State at the time, Pompeo, described it as an act of war and blamed Iran for it. And so airports have been attacked and in Saudi Arabia. And in fact, there was a report about a drone attack that was aimed, at least, or its target of this particular drone was the newly built nuclear plant in the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates denied that there was such an attack, but the Houthis claimed to have launched a drone strike in that area. The drones may not have reached their target, but apparently the nuclear facility in Abu Dhabi or near Abu Dhabi was on the Houthis' mind. Just very, very recently, just a couple of days ago, in fact, Anthony Kordsman of the Center for Strategic and International Studies published a report that you see on the screen, The Changing Military Dynamics of the Middle East and North Africa. In it, he said in 2 or 3 different places in the report that the desalination plant and other utility infrastructure are a potential target for the increasingly precise missiles that Iran possesses. I've essentially made the exact same point in my book 5 or 6 years ago, without specifying cruise missiles or precision-guided missiles and Iran, but I said terrorist attacks, terrorists may well target the desalination infrastructure in the Arab Gulf states. So by way of wrapping up my remarks, water security in the Arab Gulf states can be enhanced by mitigating potential triggers of violence from regional and local sources. Locally, there's significant domestic social grievances in the Gulf states. And through conservation of water, conservation through water demand management, um, I meant to say earlier that water consumption in the Arab Gulf states is, on per capita basis, is extremely high. It's on par with water consumption in water-rich countries like Canada. And this is primarily related to the fact that the Gulf states heavily subsidize freshwater consumption, so that they need to revisit that. And in fact, they are gradually revisiting water subsidies and oil subsidies in the Gulf. And there needs to be a greater effort to reuse, recycle and reuse wastewater. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just gonna go back to the non-presenting view. And if you could just
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you. So what we'll do now is we'll move on to questions and answers. And for that purpose, I'll go ahead and unmute all of our speakers. As I mentioned before, if you have any question, please push the button that allows you to raise your hand, and you'll be called on and unmuted. If you could just briefly introduce yourself, as well as if your question is addressed at a specific speaker, or if it's something which is addressed at the entire panel. Just make that clear when asking your question. I'll take advantage of my position as the moderator to ask the first question, and it builds on something that was mentioned by you, Dr. Hussein, but it's a question which is open to everybody. Recently, there was quite a bit of press coverage about an unverified, or as of yet unverified, allegation of a purposeful Iranian oil spill off the coast of Israel. Questions of whether a Libyan ship, whether or not it was done on purpose, whether it was an accident that was covered up, nobody is really sure. But my question is, you discussed, Dr. Hussein, things related to, kamikaze drones, more conventional, I mean, they're unconventional, but more conventional forms of attacks against critical infrastructure. My question is, if moving forward, the region has to be more concerned with instances of ecological terrorism, which are, aimed at maybe one particular actor, but which obviously, once something like that is perpetrated, you can't control the effects. Is that something which other countries in the region need to worry about? And if we look at your expertise, Dr. Sarah, if we can see something like that happening with reference to Egypt, and maybe the some of the disputes that Egypt is engaged in.
So
Yes.
allow me, if I'll just take a stab at it. Back in 1991, when Saddam Hussein's troops were attacked by American and Saudi troops, trying to get them out of Kuwait, trying to liberate Kuwait, the Iraqi army deliberately set the oil fields in Kuwait on fire, and they deliberately targeted oil tankers that were sitting in the port of Kuwait, causing a massive oil slick. And the plan was to contaminate the water intake of the desalination plants further down the coast. And the oil fires were intended to block the ability of the American Air Force from hitting Iraqi targets. So ecological terrorism has been with us for some time, and using water as a weapon, using water as a tool to pressure other actors, is also very well documented. There's an excellent database that the Pacific Institute keeps on water and conflict, and both in terms of water as a weapon and other ways that water has been politicized and securitized in the past. So it is definitely an issue that will continue to be with us. ISIS, of course, used water as a weapon quite effectively in recent years.
Thank you. Do any of our other speakers want to respond? Yes, Dr. Oded, I'm unmuting you. I asked to unmute you. I think you have to accept. Yeah, there we go. Perfect.
I think that for the time being, I'm not aware of any concerted effort by sub-states, organizations, states to use water as a water contamination as a weapon. But there is a wider problem which stems from the fact that some of the major conveying systems in the region, rivers or artificial conveyors, are above the ground, and they are open to anyone who has nefarious objectives. I think that in the future, in order to both protect against possible attempts and also reduce loss of water, in some of the countries, I know about Jordan, for example, 50% of the available drinking water lost because of systems, because stealing from open conveyors. And I think that in the future, to the extent that this is economically feasible, we should try to go underground in terms of conveying the water. This is complicated, but and maybe certainly will be more costly, but it will be paying itself by saving the problems of both terror and loss of water. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Sarah, did you want to add anything? Okay, perfect. We have our second question from Mr. Butler. I'm going to unmute you so you could ask your question.
Hello, thanks for letting me speak. And this has been a really interesting forum so far. So this question's principally for Dr. Oded Eran, but I'd love to hear other opinions as well. So you mentioned the disparities in access to water resources between Israeli and Palestinian communities and expressed a wish to reduce them. Amnesty International published a report in 2009. I'd share it, but there's not a chat function. Some of which describes the military orders and policies of the Israeli army regarding Palestinian water resources, which kind of augment these disparities. Are these limitations justified? And if not, how can we tackle them to ensure fair access for all communities?
The limitations are part of the agreement on water going back to 1995. And the 1995 interim agreement is part of what is called the Oslo agreements or ECOs. And the situation or circumstances, demographics and otherwise, have changed. Unfortunately, I would certainly go for what I suggested before, and that is decoupling as much as possible, dealing with water, environment, energy, the whole economic agreement between us and the Palestinians from the political one. I see no reason why quantities which have been agreed 25 years ago should be stuck to when we have solutions, because at the time, that is to say 1995, the desalination was, first of all, mostly uneconomic, and certainly bringing the desalinated water to the Palestinians, short distances, relatively speaking, yes, but still costly. All of these, the costs have gone down, certainly of desalination. We desalinated water at that time, if I'm not mistaken, at about $2+ for a cubic meter. Today we do it for a quarter of that price. Desalinated the water. I'm not speaking about conveying them. And so I think that if we can get the Palestinians to agree that solving these problems can be done at no expense to their claims, political claims, then I think that we should go for it. There is certainly a role for the international community to create the circumstances, give assurances to Palestinians or whatever, and certainly participate in the financing of such solution. And I am all for it.
Thank you, Dr. Oded. Do any of our other panelists want to, I know it's not maybe your expertise, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but if anybody wants to respond in addition to Dr. Oded's answer.
I just want to make a comment. Many years ago, I co-edited a book on the Jordan River Basin with my colleague and friend, Eran. So that was some time ago, and I'm obviously keeping an interest in the region, including the Jordan River. But in terms of there is severe water disparity in terms of access between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and in my view, especially given the global movement towards social justice, there needs to be greater equity in terms of access to water for all residents of that territory. And in terms of ecological terrorism, it's what we witness on the West Bank on pretty much annual basis is some settlers would go into some Palestinians' olive groves and they would cut them. So that is, in some cases, they would burn them. So that is an almost annual event on the West Bank.
Thank you. Thank you for that response. If no other comments, then we'll move on to our next question. We have a question from Miss Oki. I'm going to unmute you so you could ask your question.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the speakers for really interesting insight into the region's water insecurity. My question is primarily to Dr. Hussein, but also to the other panelists. How do you justify or make palatable a decrease in water subsidies to the local populations in a post-COVID era? I'm aware that in Jordan, just before COVID-19 hit, there were discussions about whether to increase the price of water, but those were postponed till 2021. And now I imagine they may be postponed some more following the economic impact of COVID-19. So how can Middle Eastern governments make these palatable to Middle Eastern populations?
One way of the COVID dimension is an excellent one, people need to have access to sufficient water to be hygiene or to be as clean as they can be, and so domestic water consumption is as a percentage of the different types of water that people use is the smallest. So the biggest concern is agricultural water use. And so to engage Sarah a bit on the Nile Basin, my understanding is that much of the region, certainly in Egypt, the most irrigation happens through flood irrigation, which is extremely wasteful. And even a small bit of increase in efficiency would go a long way in terms of creating additional freshwater supplies for the population, because globally, something like 70% of all water consumed it goes to agriculture. In more arid areas like Egypt and the Gulf states, that percentage goes up to 80 or 85%. So domestic water consumption, perhaps that perhaps that water should not be unsubsidized, or there needs to be greater care in handling that. But in the agricultural water supplies need to be handled differently, need to reflect more closely the real cost of water. Maybe not completely the real cost of water, because that might be too high, but there needs to be adjustment to how there needs to be incentives to farmers to conserve water, right, through pricing and other mechanisms. And also the government can have a big role to play by not authorizing plantation of water-thirsty crops. Israel, about 20 years ago, I think, began to tighten the screws on farmers who want to plant, I believe, oranges, citrus, which is fairly water-thirsty, and that reducing water consumption in the agricultural areas can and should take different approaches and different policies.
Do any of our other panelists want to address the question about water subsidies?
I think it's a very good point to talk about COVID and the sustainability and the provision of water, especially when it comes to how the government is tackling its awareness and the different healthcare challenges that have been posed by COVID. One of the main things is to be able to look at, if you look at Egypt, for instance, its Western desert is excellent land for plantation. However, the infrastructure to pumping water is very expensive, because people have to, it's diesel generated pumping. And so there's investment which is paralleled. The first one is to treat the water that comes out, which is very rich in iron. The color of the water is red, and it has to go through some kind of processing to just filter it and make it clear. The second one is to supply farmers with energy packages in the form of solar energy, so that they can use solar pumping techniques and drip irrigation, as well as looking at the various ways that agriculture can use technology assisted and also financed by banks, looking at green investments for small scale, micro and small, medium-sized enterprises. But one of the things that I feel is very important is that when it comes to planning for water, we have to look at the different sectors and their consumption of water. And it shouldn't all just be creating energy and agriculture. The construction and building sector, which all of the countries in the region are engaged in heavily, and I'm talking about investment in new cities in countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Morocco, investment in housing for growing this particular sector is responsible for a third of the energy intensity and water wastage, and it needs to be addressed just as much as transport needs to be addressed. And these is one things where it's fallen behind, so that there's action taken on certain sectors to reduce their consumption of water by investing in manufacturing of building materials that consume less water, by decreasing, using vernacular. We also have a huge problem of cooling, and cooling uses a lot of water and also increases emissions. So looking at a holistic view, similar to the Paris Agreement and the pillars and the sectoral views in the Paris Agreement, water scarcity should be addressed from now on. I think COVID is a very big lesson. From now on, as a more holistic kind of cross-sectoral issue, and it shouldn't just fall on agriculture. Especially, this is the focus in Egypt, especially now, that various different sectors have to look at their water consumption and how they would expand with that kind of measure being required, and legislation is on the way for that.
I'd like to underscore Sarah's point about the need for a holistic approach.
Thank you. We're going to move on to our next question for Mr. Naman. I'm going to unmute you now so you can ask your question.
Hi, so my question is actually about desert aquifers, which was sort of just addressed by Sarah. I was wondering if you could perhaps elaborate on whether or not desert aquifers will play a large role, particularly in North Africa, but potentially in Arabia. And if Colonel Gaddafi's great man-made river is perhaps a model, or is it too energy intensive, or what your general attitude is on that?
I mean, I'm not very aware of that, but in terms of these massive large-scale projects, when it comes to treating water as if it's in a production line, can be slightly awkward. If you look at national security and water and where Egypt's stance is, you've got, for instance, you've got a lot of investment going into creating an ecosystem whereby dependency on water needs to be addressed with efficiency and technology and public awareness, but also cross-border discussion. Projects like these have been discussed in terms of, something, for instance, like the Great Green Wall, which is, to plant across Africa, to increase food security, and to have this entire wall that is going from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, with all the countries involved, and create job opportunities and equity. So in terms of large-scale projects with these kinds of vision, they're not a priority right now, because you're looking at the sectoral, and you're also looking at the challenges and the geopolitics going on, especially with Egypt and Sudan having their requirements and the need for binding agreements, and then you have Ethiopia's stance where it needs more sort of guidelines and not agreements. I think in general, I'm not very pessimistic in general, but I do think that the sovereignty, the well-being, and the need for countries to give water to their citizens and care about their citizens' health and look to the future to serve the future generations is something incredibly important, so long as it doesn't fester more conflicts, because the region is already full of conflicts. And that's why particular projects, as the one that you're asking about, would need partnerships, we'd need global partnerships, and there needs to be stability, and there needs to be some kind of long-term vision as to the return on the investment return on such a project. It needs to be visible. So you want to get rid of any kind of instability and political unrest in order to begin a successful endeavor like that.
Thank you for that comprehensive answer. Do any of our other panelists want to respond to the question?
I would add one sentence to what Sarah said, and I will emphasize the regional dimension. The tendency until now by all states in the region to look at the water problem on just on the national level and the limiting the thinking to the political borders is gone. You cannot continue to work on or to think about on this in this paradigm. There's no solution which is national, and you don't bring this way the relative advantages of each of the participants. Not in the case of Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, not in the case of Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, not in the case of Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. These are all regional problems which cannot be solved on a national level. And therefore, and this I think what we need from players, actors outside the region is trying to create this political umbrella for such cooperation. I know that for today, for example, Ethiopia and Egypt may be bringing into the negotiations the EU, the United States, the African Union. I think that this is a positive move towards looking at the issues on a regional / international level. Thank you.
Thank you for that comprehensive answer as well. We have another question from Alicia Ishaki. I'm going to unmute you now so you can ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. I actually have a kind of a follow-up question to what Mr. Oded Eran was saying, that this isn't just a nation state problem. It isn't just a regional problem. Especially in the Gulf, there's this huge reliance on drinking water from multinational corporations. And this is often bottled water from companies which face criticism for taking this water from other parts of the world where it's also becoming more scarce and also unequally divided. So this is, for example, Nestle or Coca-Cola with Dasani. So we have this kind of over-reliance on bottled water on one hand, and the inability of the government to deliver drinking water that is trusted from the faucet. So what do you think should maybe be the role of multinational corporations in facilitating government water supply, and where do you see this developing in the future?
I want to be slightly provocative, not against you, against the multilateral, multinational companies. I think that for the time being, the energy market, for example, is mostly following the very traditional thinking about the connection between all these elements, environment, water, energy, and they're thinking, and I can understand why or where does this thinking coming from, and that is to say we have the traditional sources of energy. This is how we make money, and we don't want the green revolution to be introduced so fast and so quickly before we used the fossil resources. Governments are governments which own the natural resources, oil, natural gas, are following this line of thinking. I'm thinking about my own government. it has, we have found a medium-sized quantities of gas. The government is expecting to get royalties, and it doesn't want to get rid of these royalties so fast. And so you have a competition between the need to go green on the one hand, to abide by international standards which are beginning to be developed, the Paris Agreement and others, and the wish to benefit from the royalties of what exists today. And I think that there is a transformation which takes place in front of our eyes. I see it in the region, in Jordan and in Egypt and other countries, that the green thinking is stepping in. It may not be achievable by 2030, but okay, it will take another 5 years, but it's coming. Thank you.
Elisha, you asked an excellent question. And so in thinking about it, let me make a couple of remarks. In my view, multinational corporations have succeeded over the last 30 or so years in developing an image of bottled water as being clean, cleaner than your faucet water, which in the Gulf states, that's not necessarily the case. I mean, they're equally as clean. Faucet water is pretty clean in the Arab Gulf states. And also they succeeded in developing an image and selling an image that you, especially the youth, you carry a bottle, bottled water in your hand, that you're signaling to others that you're healthy, you're fit, you're taking care of yourself, kind of thing. And it's difficult to undo this mental image, I think, that they have created. So this will be quite the struggle, and the dependence will be hard to undo. We, I think, need to definitely question it. We need to undo it. The environmental impact of the bottled water industry is huge. And they one of the adaptations that the bottled water industry is trying to do is because they know the youth have now have changed. They have different perspective on the environment. So on some university campuses, they're having water fountains that you bring your own bottled water to, your own bottle to that fountain, and you fill it, obviously at a cost, right? So.
I just wanted to say that this kind of mentality that Alicia you're speaking about exists not just with bottled water. I mean, it's everywhere. And there's a very clever way for companies to go around this, because they're always diverting the consumer's attention. So now the issue is to have the biodegradable, good plastic bottling, but not talk about the water itself and not talk about the actual problem itself. So, and this we see it all the time, you know, in the architectural sector, we make very inefficient buildings that have leaks, that are overheating and need cooling, but then, you know, someone comes along and puts solar panels on the top and suddenly it's working. So this offsetting culture has been something that's been going around since the 70s, but with people coming in and questioning and not settling in everything, you're pushing the boundaries with these multinationals that they have to answer to various sectors and various different intellectual levels and needs for different consumers. We're not one consumer anymore. We're different consumers looking for different forms of satisfaction. And so I think the future of bottled water will be not to waste it on decorating the bottled water or changing the vessel it's in, but investing in the infrastructure of providing faucet water. So I'm hopeful that, you know, people are very aware of what's going on. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, and thank you to everybody for their answers. We have one last question from Francesca, who I'm going to unmute. so you could ask your question.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. It was very fascinating. My question kind of speaks to international law and the sort of international approach that has already slightly been touched on. I was just wondering, in two parts, do you think you can see any cooperation between, say, the African Union and the Arab League in the region as sort of regional organization in the collaboration? And, or do you think this will go to sort of a UN level to have more enforceability? And do you believe there'll be binding treaties of this nature to maybe even form a new organization to monitor water, scarcity, and environmental problems linked to the environment? And this question is open to anybody. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll make a quick note. I don't know a whole lot about the African Union, but I do know something about the Arab League. And from my best understanding of the Arab League is it's a fairly ineffectual body. And there definitely needs to be greater coordination and across Africa on environmental issues and the Middle East, obviously, and in the Nile Basin, my best understanding is that's not happening. Not a whole lot of it is happening. Dr. Sarah follows this more closely, and maybe others, but yeah, go ahead. I'll stop.
We are now, this year, celebrating 30 years to the Madrid Conference. Madrid Conference was basically sort of a continuation of the war in Iraq in 1991. The US had leveraged the success of the war, participation of a coalition, including Arab states, and brought the Middle East countries and others to Madrid, to an international conference, and created there 5 working groups. Two of the working groups, or 3 in fact, one was on economic affairs, one was on water, and one was on the environment. And the 5 working groups worked until 1996 in wonderful cooperation between all the countries involved, mostly the Israelis, the Palestinians, Jordanians, and Egyptians. I was involved in the economic group, and I remember to this very day, the really constructive cooperation between these 4 entities. I think that it's time to try to revive some of the ideas which came out from the Madrid conference. Certainly the international circumstances, i.e. the EU and the United States are now having a dialogue between them. We have in the region some new developments with what is called the Abraham Accords, a cooperation between Egypt and Israel, cooperation between Jordan and Israel, and it's quite possible to revive a regional work together with the assistance of the international community. Thank you.
It would be incredibly important to realize that, you know, lumping everyone together in order for them to agree is somewhat impossible, because the diversity within the Middle East and the diversity within North African countries is incredible. I mean, that is part of the cultural richness of this area. And so we have to be careful while assuming that there would be agreement on many fronts. However, there are opportunities in the negotiations to bring people together by highlighting a common enemy. And the common enemy for everyone is that you have climate change challenges that are facing young nations that need growth, that need housing, that need food security, and that need equal opportunities in order to avoid conflicts, in order to avoid spillage of conflicts and migration, and also rejection for potential investments within the area due to this lack of instability. And so I think if the politicians politicize the issue less and humanize the issue more and rely on innovation, because that is the driver, innovation, there will be lots of potential to find common ground in order to get people to agree. And I definitely really put, I put my bets on the ability for these countries to forecast the challenges, not just for the short and medium term, the long term, because every 25 years, the technology will change, the capacity for countries will change, the political aspirations and the people doing the things change. They're not constants, but the need to protect water, the need to give nations what they want, and opportunities and equity is something that is a constant. And so I'm hoping that a fresh new outlook on this is definitely being projected onto the political arena as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our speakers. In the interest of time, we're going to end the event. I wanted to thank everybody for participating, and again, particularly our panelists for taking the time out and really putting together what I think was a fascinating event. Before we finish, I'll just remind everyone to have a look at our social media and sign up to our mailing list if you haven't done so yet. We have an interesting event coming up later this month on the nuclear aspirations of different countries in the region, from Iran to Turkey, as well as a number of other case studies, which we'll be discussing. Other than events, which, as I mentioned before, we publish on our mailing list as well as on our social media, we have a free news update service that comes out once a week, published by our team of language and regional experts on the most recent updates as to what's happening in the region, and a strategic overview of the things that we recommend people look out for in the coming weeks. And lastly, we have our Manara Journal, of which we're about to publish our most recent volume and have begun recruiting writers for our latest version, the topic of which is going to be 10 years since the Arab Spring. The submissions, as I mentioned before, are paid, and we're really happy to consider submissions from a wide range of people from different experiences. Thanks again to everybody for participating tonight, and thank you again to Dr. Oded, Dr. Hussein, and Dr. Sarah for participating. And we look forward to seeing everybody at future events. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Thank you.